Welcome everybody. This is the How to Start Birding webinar part 3. So we'll be talking about basic birding identification. I'm here today. My name is Brittany Like. I'm the program coordinator, and I have a new assistant today, Sierra.
Hi,
And so
I'm Sierra.
If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide.
Certainly can.
Yeah. As I mentioned a few seconds ago, we're going to be talking about a wide range of things today, kind of what Sam was asking for. You can find here, it's identification tips. It's where you can go to find birds and other related things that really will give you direction. So hopefully you can find some of those things out on your own by using some of the pointers that we have for you. Any other inputs here?
It pretty much covered it. So I wanted to give a little introduction about who we are and kind of our organizations. My name is Sierra. I am an education specialist here at the Belle Isle Nature Center. The Belle Isle Nature Center also works really in close partnership with the Detroit Zoo. So I'm fairly new to this position. I started in September, but I have been an avid birder for quite some time. And we both included our favorite birds, and my favorite bird is the pileated woodpecker. If you guys would like to, you can share your favorite bird in the chat. I'm kind of really interested to see how everyone is feeling.
Yeah.
And
and find out what if some of your favorite birds are as well. Which, speaking of, Sierra, actually, I was over at Kensington a couple weekends ago, and there was a mating pair of pileated woodpeckers.
Nice.
Yeah, I was pretty excited about that. But as Sierra says, my favorite's a chimney swift. But I don't know about you, Sierra, but I feel like I have a huge list of favorites. It's just one of many.
Yeah, that one's probably on the top of the list. Those are probably up there, but there's definitely others.
Yeah, I saw a few other red-breasted nuthatch, peacock, great blue heron, all great birds. So wonderful.
Ready to move forward?
Yeah.
All right. So I wanted to start the day off with kind of getting an idea of where you guys are at as far as your bird ID, and then what kinds of things would it benefit you to know about bird identification? So a few questions. What would you like to know? How do you think we can help you become more familiar with birds? And then when you're out in the field, what do you feel like you struggle with most when trying to ID birds? So if you have any of these thoughts in your head, feel free to drop them in the chat. And as I go through, I'll see if we can address some of these, and hopefully by the end, we'll have less questions, more enthusiasm. So let's move forward. So in this webinar today, I'll be covering a few different identifying qualities of birds. And these are the different aspects that makes each little species different from each other. That's going to be the size and the shape, the color of the bird, the sounds they make, behaviors they do, and the habitat that they live in. I will say that sound is a whole wealth of information that we could spend a whole separate webinar on. So we have included a link that you can follow that has a webinar that covers sound a little bit more in detail. Today, we're mostly going to just be looking at the size and shape, the color patterns, and the behaviors and habitats of different species of birds, and how that can help you identify who they are. So one of the things that you do, or one of the first things you start doing when you go out birding, is you pick yourself up a field guide and a pair of binoculars, and you head on outside. There is a scale to the field guides. There are some that we would consider more beginner field guides, and then others that as you keep going would be more considered advanced. So when you're looking at these, the beginner guides are going to be more of a smaller range of birds. It's going to be mostly with pictures. It's going to have like larger images and less detail. something that when you open it up, you can just quickly find some of the more common backyard birds. It's not going to get too detailed on like their calls and independent behaviors. So when we're thinking about beginner birding books, and something that you probably want to get if you're just starting out, so you're not too overwhelmed with a wealth of knowledge, you can kind of get these little folding ones. We have tons of these at the Nature Center. This one is for Michigan wildlife, but it also has tons of other little birds. You can see that it's just got some general birds, and they are easily accessible. You can open it right up to them. As you get further into the more advanced field guides, they're going to have more information about particulars, where you can find that bird. And then you have some field guides that are just audio, if you would like something that is strictly where you could just study the birds. I like the audio CDs because it says the name and then plays the sound, and it's a really good way to kind of lock that in. But we're kind of going to want to range down towards the beginner end of things. So when you're looking at your field guide, if you're not really sure, if you've not opened one before or not seen one, it can be a little disorienting to kind of figure out what you're looking at. It is really a good idea to understand your particular field guide, because they're all built a little differently, but they all have similar structures. So when you are using it, you want to be able to open up and go right to what you're looking for. So it is probably in your best interest to become familiar with your own. So in field guides, you can usually find at the top, it's just a general description about the species. Let's see if I can turn on my little laser pointer. You can see a general description about the species here. It will usually tell you about the size, how common it is, and where you can generally find it, the name of the species, as well as their scientific name. Field guides will also often include depictions of the plumage of the bird. For the most part, they will include their breeding and male plumages. Sometimes you can get female plumages, like this one also has female and juvenile, which can sometimes be different. So depending on the type of field guide you get, they'll either have all of those different depictions or just like one, usually breeding male. So that is what's in the middle there. And then at the bottom, most field guides will offer a range map, and this is where you can find that species throughout different times of the year. The map is color coded, so you can figure out what season you're in and whether or not you'll find that species here. Usually they're broken up into different colors, where blue is more winter, purple is usually year round, orange, I believe, is normally migration, and then yellow is summer. So you can check out your own field guide and see how those colors match up. And another thing I want to suggest is something that I did when I first started out, is that I would keep my field guide on me, and anytime I saw a bird, I'd flip it open and try to compare while I was there. It's probably best to use your field guide as a reference. So just keep it in mind, think about how it works, keep it with you on the field, and when you're out and about, take a look with just your eyes and then go back and refer to your guide. Another good way to use to ID birds is to use bird identification mobile apps. There's a few different ones that you can use. I have a preference of Merlin. I really like Merlin, mostly because it can do both visual and audio bird ID. So this one, you can either take a picture of the bird and it can categorize as what it is, or you can record sound in it. So if you're just going on a nature walk, you can kind of hold it up and it will record different sounds. It's a really cool little app. There's also another one that lets you like go through different identifying characteristics of it, and it will give you a general idea of what species you're looking at. Then you also have apps like iNaturalist, and iNaturalist has Seek, and Seek is really awesome. We use it a lot here at the Nature Center because you can just point it at lots of different species of plants and animals, and it will identify it for you. So it's really cool. And then lastly, eBird. eBird is kind of a group collective. So if you are out in a field and you see a bird outside, you see an eagle flying overhead, you can upload that into eBird. So it records different records of what other people have seen. So it's a good way to see what other people have seen and what you can kind of keep an eye out for if you think you saw a bird, you can check eBird, see other people have saw it, and it kind of gives you an idea, okay, yes, that's probably what that species is. So all three apps have their benefits, and I would suggest using one of them if you're out in the field and you don't have a field guide on you.
Yeah, which I do want to add a little extra note for eBird, which kind of answers a little bit of a question we had earlier, was where to go to find birds. So eBird is also great in a reverse situation of not only advertising or posting what you found in a certain area, but say you want to see if a park you're planning to go to has seen a lot of birds lately, or if you're looking for a specific bird, you can actually see what has been seen in the last few days, in the last 7 days. And say you're thinking of going to a different park in particular, check it out. If not many birds have been reported, it might have been a slower time frame. So maybe you'd go to a different park that has had more activity. And so it's a great way to kind of pre-plan where you might go out birding, is by using eBird beforehand.
I will often do that myself when when I have like a few different spots that I like to go to. I'll check eBird and see what has the most action right now. But with field guides, there are some guides you want to kind of keep in mind. Every bird is a little bit different. They're all not like direct copies of one another. So individuals of a species may look different than how they're depicted in the field guide. Also, birds molt their feathers, and they will sometimes molt them in different sections, like this little blue jay here, he's having quite a time. So if you do see birds out in the field and they're in between molts, they may not look exactly like how they are looking in your guide. So just keep that in mind, as well as molting and seasonal color changes will also change a bird. So if you have a field guide that only has a bird in its summer plumage and it's winter, just keep that in mind. They may not always be bright as they are during breeding season.
Yeah, something else to think about though is not only that, but diseases. So sometimes there's diseases that affect the feathers. So that could also affect what feathers they have collecting on their chest, on their head, things like that. And if it looks diseased, do make sure you report it to the DNR, because they do need to keep track of diseases, which, like I said, can impact plumage.
All right, now we are going to move into our identifying qualities of birds. And the very first one I want to look at is size and shape, because that is going to be kind of the first indicator as to what kind of bird you're looking at when you're trying to do identification. So birds come in all different shapes and sizes. A lot of these sizes and shapes you're already aware of. So if we were to look, for example, at these birds here, and you were trying to figure out what species they were and trying to ID them, I would say that many people probably have an idea of what they are. Just growing up in this world and looking outside, we can kind of see what an animal is, where it might live, and what kind of behaviors it might exhibit just from looking at the general shape of its body. So take a look at these guys here, and then we can see who they are. And as I said, you probably already knew. We have an owl, a cardinal, a sparrow, and a mallard. So these are very well identifiable species. And so when you're out and about and you kind of just when a bird is first in front of you and you are just seeing its shape, what does it remind you of? Have you seen something like this before? And so that can kind of help you funnel it into different categories. Is it a bird of prey? Is it a small perching bird? Does it have webbed feet that makes you think that perhaps it lives in the water? And that can help you figure out what area of your field guide you might need to go to for identification. Another great identifier for bird species is the shape of the bill. Bird bills have been evolved over years to do very specific tasks. So if you look at different species, you can see that a crow's bill is much different than a woodpecker's bill or a raptor's bill, because they're all made to do very different things. So even if you have two species that at one point in time can look very similar, a lot of times by checking their bill, you can figure out what is it eating and what is that bill designed to do. And that can help you refer back to your field guide.
Uh-huh.
It's the peanut one.
Ooh.
It's
For
mainly
example, I have two species here, the scarlet tanager and the American goldfinch. These are both in their non-breeding plumage. So if they were just flying by you, you would kind of imagine that they look pretty similar. But if you were to like snap a picture of them and look a little bit closer, you can see that their bills are designed for very different things. The scarlet tanager has more of an insect-eating bill, whereas the goldfinch has more of a chisel-like seed-eating bill. So that is a really good way to kind of figure out who is this guy that I'm looking at, even though they look very similar. Another great thing to check is size and shape, and then to scale and compare between similar species. One that is pretty common that is the downy and the hairy woodpecker comparisons. The downy woodpecker is a fairly common species, and then the hairy woodpecker comes by every once in a while, but when you see them, at times they can be a little hard to tell apart. But if you were to scale them to each other and themselves, you can see that the hairy woodpecker has a significantly larger bill. So if you were comparing between the sizes of a species, even though they look very similar, that can help you tell them apart. If a bird is of similar shape, for example, this Canada goose and this trumpeter swan, if you were further away and you couldn't quite make out the colorations, but you could see they were similar shape, you could tell that the trumpeter swan is significantly larger than the Canada goose. Same thing for our bald eagles and our osprey. If you see a large bird of prey in the sky, sometimes just looking at the size of it can tell you whether or not you're looking at something like an eagle, an osprey, or something even smaller, like a hawk. So let's move into color and pattern. That is one of the best identifiers for IDing birds. There are a few different areas on a bird that you want to look at. There is the eye line, the eye ring, the breast, the wing bars, and the rump and the tail. When you're looking at different species, a lot of times they will have similar colors in some spots in some of these areas, but very rarely will they have the exact same details in every single spot here. So keeping track of these little field markers can help you figure out what species you're looking at, especially when it comes to these smaller birds and areas around their like head. Many of the smaller sparrows and chickadees, they have differentiating eye rings, eye lines, and crowns. So we're going to take a look at some of the different ways that you can inventory these colors here. If I can. So a lot of times when you're out in the field, or if you're just at a bird feeder, a bird can fly quickly overhead or stop at feeder for just a second and then fly away. And you only have a few moments to capture what you're looking at before it's gone. A great thing to do is to build a color inventory in your head of what you're seeing before it flies off and goes away. For example, if you were to see a blue jay land and you weren't sure if it was a blue jay or some other kind of blue bird, you just would quickly go down the list and look at what colors did you notice before it flew away. For the blue jay, I would say I saw a lot of blues, blacks, browns, and whites. If I was to refer back to my field guide, I would see that there's a blue jay, but there's also another bluebird in there called the eastern bluebird. The inventory or the colors on this guy is blue, orange, and white. So seeing as I didn't see that flash of orange when I was taking my inventory, I'd probably lean more towards a blue jay than a bluebird. And you can do this with all kinds of species. It's useful for sparrows and woodpeckers and warblers and those tiny little guys that you just see for a second. You can just pick out a few different colors that you see on there and then take those with you when you're looking back at your guide. So let's do a little bit of a color inventory right now. I've got 2 birds here on my screen. If everyone wants to kind of just take a second and look at the field markers and take a quick color inventory of these species. So if we take a look at both of their heads, both of their breasts, their wing bars, and their rumps and tails, where do we see differences? Are these the same species or are they different species? So let's take a few seconds, look at them, see if you can identify them and drop them in the chat. And then we will kind of give ourselves a little bit of a quiz, see if we can ID these guys. So like we mentioned earlier, take a look at the bills. Are there any significant differences between the two? Take a look at the wing bars right here. Is there anything that stands out between the 2 bars? And the chest area, how do they differ? So yes to one of our participants there. We have an American redstart on the left here and a Baltimore Oriole on the right. These are both male versions or males of this particular species. So while they look very similar, you can notice that the Baltimore Oriole does have more white on the wings, and the redstart has a black chest. The bill on the Baltimore Oriole is definitely more sharp. So these are things that you can look at. And as you go through your time, as you find more birds, they'll just become, these markers will just become a part of your memory. Though you'll be able to kind of look at a bird, look at that beak, look at that wing, look at those wings, and just know that that's going to be a Baltimore Oriole. Or if it doesn't have those, perhaps it's something else, perhaps a redstart. So take a quick look at this because in 1 second, we're going to do a little checkpoint. So let's say somebody comes up to you and they're trying to describe a bird that they just saw. They say that this bird has a black head, it's got a sharp pointed bill, it's got a round plump body, an orange breast, orange and white wing bars, and then a black and orange tail. I think that we're looking at just based off of those identifying qualities. So if anyone has any ideas, go ahead and cast your vote in the chat.
Yeah. Do you say?
Got a few answers here. So this guy would actually be the Baltimore Oriole. So there are a few things that stand out for the Oriole that makes you realize that it's not a redstart. So the Orioles have sharp pointed bills. They have an orange breast and the white and black wing bars. This is something that the redstarts don't have. So when you're looking at your field guide before you head out to start ID and you know that these birds might be in your area, you can look at those key spots and kind of figure out what are those differences that I'll be looking for when I'm out in the field. Let's take a look now at the next identifying quality, which would be behavior. So birds have a ton of different behaviors that separate them from one another. I would like to think out of all of our animal species we have, that birds are pretty unique when it comes to the behaviors that they do. Some of them, they do one thing and you can immediately know that that is that particular species. For example, if someone comes up to me and they're at the bird feeder and they say that they see a bird and it's climbing up and down and around a tree, it's upside down on the tree, I would more than likely say that that's probably the nuthatch you're looking at there. That is a very identifiable nuthatch behavior. So learning those different things that birds do can make it really easy to figure out who you're looking at. All right, let's get to the next slide here, maybe, possibly. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the different flight patterns that birds have. When you're looking at a bird, try to notice their wings, because their wings will really kind of give you an idea of how it's going to fly. And then try to notice the flight patterns of different species as you're looking at them, ones that you already know, and then kind of remember how it flies for future reference. So let's go over some of the few main types of flight patterns. And I will mention that some of these species do more than one of these flight patterns. So you may see them in multiple categories. The first one I want to look at is direct flight. So this is a continual wing beat. These birds fly in a very straight line, like continuously flapping their wings. And you can see this done a lot of times by crows, geese, herons. I've seen birds like eagles even do it too. So they can do multiple different kinds, just that continuous long flaps. Usually these species will have wide wings like this, or the Canada goose's wide wings. So let's take a look, possibly, at that flight pattern. Maybe. I think I can. No, I can't get my video to work. So I would highly encourage everyone in the chat right now or logged on to visit the Museum of Science's website. That is where I picked up these videos here, but they give a very good idea of the different styles of birds' flight patterns. And they're linked up to these really cute like piano tunes. So you should definitely check them out.
Maybe just try clicking the link at the bottom right. Maybe that'll help.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
If I can't get it to work by the end of the videos, I will let you know. Another type of flight pattern that you can notice is an undulating flight pattern. So these birds, they will do a flap, flap, flap to kind of like a little bit like a roller coaster to push themselves up higher. And then they will do like a bounding downwards. And you can see this in woodpeckers, sparrows, and finches. I really like to point it out in goldfinches because they will also do their little calls like as they're flying, like do-do-do, do-do-do. So that is definitely one to notice when you're looking at the little birds and the woodpeckers. Liz, I wish I could get my videos to work. Another type of flight pattern is the flap and glide. And you can see this in swallows, hawks, and owls. I will say typically in hawks and owls, when they're doing this type of flap pattern is when they're hunting. So if you see a bird doing this, kind of look out, see where he's going. But for this one, it is a general flap, 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 and then they will hold their wings outwards and just fly. This is a little bit different than the flap and glide, where they're flap, 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 and they pull their wings in to kind of bound downwards. These guys, they will flap, flap, and then keep their wings straight outwards. So you can see that in barn swallows, owls, and hawks, and then quite a few other species as well. And then this one is probably my favorite type of flight pattern. It is the moth-like flight pattern, mostly because you can see it in doves and pigeons, like our rock dove friend there. If you've ever seen a group of pigeons kind of take off and they spread out their wings and they kind of fly in a bunch of random directions, that is essentially what the moth-like pattern is. You can see it in nighthawks and plovers, such as killdeers. It is a quick kind of buzzing with a lot of changing directions in random orders. So if you were to see that, some species don't do certain flight patterns. So if you see this, you can know that that's probably not some birds. Like, it's probably not going to be a crow, for example, because they don't really have those weird zigzaggy flights. And then we have our static soaring. This is also done by birds that have pretty broad, wide wings, because they use those wings to ride thermals up in the sky. So as the hot air rises, those birds will ride it. And that's usually why you'll see birds like eagles and vultures and gulls circling in the sky in places where there's lots of like open air, like beaches or by water, you know. So that is another type of flying that you can see. And like I said, it's usually done by those species that have those really big wings. Usually larger species will do the soaring.
Which it's also a behavior you typically see specifically during hawk migration. So the image is a really good example of what happens when hawks and other raptors are migrating south in the fall. Is they actually will use big currents of air to lift them up. And that's kind of, it's almost like you see that a little bit in this image above the turkey vulture, where they'll fly, hit a patch of wind moving them up, the draft will pull them up and they'll soar outward. And then when they lower again, they'll use it and they'll lift up again. And it's actually a really cool thing to see if you have not had a chance to.
I know during migration, it'll be just clear skies, and all of a sudden, like a whole group of vultures will just come swinging by, and then off they go. It's a pretty cool thing to see.
Yeah, if you see it and you're driving, make sure you pull over, because it's the best thing for your safety.
So speaking of on behavior, you want to also look at, besides flying, what else is that bird doing? I chose these 4 behaviors because if you were using the Merlin app and you're trying to figure out what kind of bird you're using, these are kind of the 4 main types of behaviors that can help you separate a bird into a specific category, because you probably wouldn't see a rock dove swimming. So it can help you really figure out what kind of bird you're looking at. So a few of the different behaviors are walking on the ground. And this is just like ground birds. Most birds can walk on the ground. They can either walk or hop, but some birds will spend significantly more time on the ground than others. And that can help you figure out who you are looking at. And then you also have swimming and wading. So wading birds like egrets and herons. And then an assortment of swimming birds, lots of different ducks. Something you will want to ask yourself, is the bird soaring? So like we mentioned earlier, the soaring, there's the soaring on thermals, and then there's also soaring where they're just kind of gliding. So some species of birds soar. So if you see it, that can help you kind of figure out who that is. And then perching. There are a whole subset of birds known as perching birds. And they've got little specialized feet. So that can help you figure out who is that bird And if it's sitting and perching like that and has those specialized feet, it's going to be in that category somewhere. So now we will kind of move into our, where can you find birds and where do you see birds?
Yeah. So before I get into this, I did have a question just now. Someone asked, where can you find parts 1 and 2? This is titled part 3. Yeah, they are pre-recorded. You can find them on the Detroit Audubon website. I will try to remember at the end to put the link into chat. But yes, they are, all of our presentations are pre-recorded, including this one. So you can watch it at a later date if you missed part of it. So this is kind of where we're getting into, now that we've talked about how to help you identify birds, besides us just telling you, yeah, that's a bird, it's looking at the details and trying to make that, figure that out on your own. So now it's, how do we help you find where to get the birds? Where do you see them? And there are some questions listed below here that I wanted you to kind of think about. It's, where have you seen them before? What has been nearby that attracted them? And then what are some of those needs that you've seen them in? So these 3 pictures are a really good example. So they're odd places. The middle one's kind of more commonly where you've seen birds, but what in nature is that replicating? And for me, that replicates a long branch. So birds frequently will perch on tree branches, and so they'll use man-made structures to perch nowadays. The first picture is nesting habitat. Unfortunately, birds lose a lot of dead trees where they nest in the tree cavities. And so if they can find something that replicates a tree cavity, such as this bucket hanging from a hose, they'll try and use that. Or for the goose, nesting in a structure that is kind of out of the way of people, but it's something similar to where it would have nested before. And so thinking about, okay, I've seen this bird in an area, why was it there? And it kind of gets you thinking about their needs and how you can replicate those needs in your own property, business, or wherever you may be. So here kind of, I'm trying to break this down in a more basic way than people probably really think about, because that's the thing with biology and nature, is it is the basics of the basic. It's some things that are so simple that oftentimes we kind of look past it and we don't think about it until it's brought up. And so that's kind of our goal today, is to kind of get you thinking about those things. So what are the basic needs of birds or any creature? Food, water, and shelter. This picture does a really good job, and I'm not sure if you guys notice all the tiny little black bird shadows and silhouettes throughout the picture. You can see them hanging on branches, in shrubs. You see them in the water, on dead trees, near the collection of branches on the ground. And I have these 4 arrows. So the first one to the left is pointing towards shrubs. So it's really important that, yeah, trees are great, they're really important, but shrubs are equally as important. And shrubs can be shorter, they can be taller. It really depends on what species you have in your yard or what you want to plant. But shrubs are really important because they have more branching closer together, so they provide shelter against the wind when we have really cold, windy days. They also typically have a lot of fruit and berries and food resources for them. You move over a little bit to the right and you have it pointing at water. Every creature in nature needs water. Further over from the right there, you see it pointing at a dead tree. A lot of people's first assumption is, it's a dead tree, I need to cut it down. But birds need that for shelter. So the first thing that comes along usually are the woodpeckers. They'll peck a hole in it, kind of like you see on this dead tree. And they'll nest in it one year, but then they'll build another nest somewhere else, and another bird will come in and use that as a shelter for their own nest the next year. And so one thing after another will start to use this dead tree as a resource. Further over from the right there, you have what looks like a bunch of dead branches or dead leaves all over the ground. That is great because it provides shelter for smaller birds, or it provides shelter for what they eat as food sources, which we will talk about more here soon. So This is, I love this picture. I think it's a really good example of comparing what people typically see versus what is slowly becoming more popular. So on the left here, you have just this really dynamic, diverse keyword. I'm going to use that a lot more later. Diverse environment. And so you have big trees, you have flowers, you have water, there's a little bird bath. There's a lot of variety and diversity in this environment. And one thing that I also love about is it talks about the root systems. You can compare the root systems between the two. So not only does this habitat benefit the birds and wildlife, but it benefits humans by managing the stormwater runoff. You look over at the right, I guess my first thought is getting people to think about which picture or which side of the picture looks more diverse. So just in case everyone doesn't know, diverse is the larger varieties of things involved. So it's basically not a monoculture. Monoculture is one single species. So a lawn is a monoculture. When you have a prairie, it is a diverse environment. Lots of different species, which provides more food and resources for a wider range of species. If you plant trees or shrubs, planting a wide range of them, not just a single species. There's multiple benefits to having a diverse environment in your property or area. And so this is just a great picture to kind of show what that looks like. So again, further breaking it down. So I wanted to get people to think about, again, those really basic needs of birds. Water. What is involved with what has water in your area that would attract birds? Most people think bird bath. It's a great option. If you have a small property, putting up a bird bath is a really nice opportunity. They do make heated bird baths. That helps. That way you can still provide them in the winter. If you have an area that collects a lot of water, maybe you leave the puddle there because birds will use those puddles. I'm sure if you ever drive by and you see birds in a puddle as you drive nearby, they'll fly off, they fly right back. They love that water, especially because there's not as much water buildup otherwise. People don't like it. And then there's lakes, rivers, and the obvious of what people always see. But thinking about ways of how can you collect or gather water nearby for you, whether that's a bird bath, leaving puddles, maybe you install a rain garden, or you build some other structure that would collect water a little bit more effectively for you, but maybe you add a water wiggler or something that keeps the water moving, so you reduce the chances of mosquitoes building up. So there's lots of ways you can manage it, and there's ways for it to benefit birds and other wildlife without being a problem for you. Next one is shelter. So again, most people think of birdhouses. So birdhouses are a great option. You do need to kind of think about when it comes to birdhouses, what they attract is based on the hole on the birdhouse as well as the size of the birdhouse. So certain birdhouses are significantly smaller than the one in the picture that would be more considered a chickadee or a wren house. The size you're looking at in this image with the swallows is considered what more of a bluebird size house. Now your bluebird size house, the swallows will use it, bluebirds, your sparrows, a lot of those more common size birds. You have to keep in mind with bluebird houses or houses in general, predator species such as snakes, raccoons, other raptor species sometimes will use those to collect food sources. There are ways you can protect them. I do encourage you to check out and talk to your nearest Wild Birds Unlimited. They would be able to talk about this a lot more effectively and find out what works best for your area. If you're going to install a bluebird house or any other house, you do want to make sure you have more knowledge than just putting it up. There's a lot that can be involved with keeping it safe, it clean, and attracting the birds you want it to. Moving from that into the more natural things that are provided as shelter, the dead trees. So I do want to talk about this a little bit because I'm sure a lot of you are relating to this right now. I have 2 pine trees in my yard that may or may not need to be taken down because it's not really a good safety, it's a safety hazard. And so something we're considering is trimming it first, but if we ever have to take them down, if you say you have a tree in your yard that's not really safe, you want to cut it down for whatever reason it may be, leaving about 15 feet of the base of the tree trunk up. Don't cut it down, it saves you money, and it provides a resource and shelter for wildlife, such as your woodpeckers and other creatures. If you have a bigger property and you can leave it up entirely, awesome, but a lot of people don't have that luxury. So finding a middle ground, leaving part of it up, and that's a great option. From there, say you have no other choice and you have to cut down a big portion of it, pile up the big pieces of trunks and branches in the back corner of your property, kind of like you see here is what's called a brush pile. That is a great resource because salamanders, frogs, other small rodents, and your birds will use them as shelter, which is really good because then you might also attract birds that you would want to, such as maybe an owl, because it will see, oh, there's a collection of brush piles. Maybe they'll start going there and you might get other species into your yard, or if you see it, there's a chance that other species may be lingering by. So it's another great resource for shelters. From there, food. Again, a little more obvious, but all of the things that you can attract into your yard, starting from plants, will attract the insects, will attract other small creatures like birds and mammals because they'll eat the insects. If you can install a pond and bring in some fish, or if you just go into an area, look around you, see what you're finding. So if you see the shelter, if you see a water body, if you see a big patch of prairie, or a big body of water, all of those things are great. And it's just looking around you and being aware of what is around you that attracts birds and why. And so it's not just seeing the birds, it's where you're finding them and thinking about that in a more dynamic way. So from here, we'll take it a little step further. Now we've talked about the basics. We're going to talk about urban birding habitat. So we're starting with urban birding. We're going to move into rural birding afterwards, and then things that attract birds or that you can install in your own property that help to attract the birds as well. So here with the urban birding, always keep in mind that habitat is all around us, whether it's natural or man-made. And these pictures do a really good job of showing that as an example. So starting from the left, you have two really obvious ones. You have lots of big trees, shrubs that are really good because you can place them in open areas that maybe you're not using as much. So trees along roadways benefit people, benefit animals, and gotta love the trees. From there, maybe you have a section of property between your road or your sidewalk that really you just don't feel like mowing anymore. You might see some front and back gardens. Those are great areas to place them. From there, kind of jumping over the middle picture, you have parks and gardens nearby. So that's a really, I guess I'm curious how many of you can tell what picture that is, where it is. It is in our area. It's right across the river from Belle Isle, the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy. So that's one of their parks. They did a great job. They installed this little section of a park along the water. And it's perfect because there's a big park for everyone to enjoy. But not only is there open grass for people to use, there's trees, and there's a really nice mixture of small shrubs and flowers. So again, that diversity, love the diversity. And then the two remaining pictures are more man-made structures. So because humans as a whole have largely destroyed nature and natural habitats for us to colonize, birds have adapted over time to start using man-made structures that resemble or replicate things in nature. So sometimes you'll see, if you go to a local park, there's a flat structure for ospreys to nest. This one is actually a really good example on Belle Isle. the ospreys have nested on the lights outside of the sports field. And so that's a replication in nature. The one to the right is chimney swifts, my favorite bird, you know. The chimney swifts, what they used to do is they would nest in old tree cavities that were completely hollowed out. People cut them down, and it's really hard for chimney swifts to find those nesting cavities anymore. And so they have adapted over a long period of time to use chimneys as nesting areas or roosting areas, because chimney swifts largely spend a good portion of their life flying in the air. So the only time they aren't flying is when they're roosting in a chimney or a tree cavity. And so when you have a chimney, such as this picture is based out of Farmington, it's one of the largest populations of chimney swifts in the United States. And you can see thousands of chimney swifts flying in. This is just a small image in comparison, but they'll find things in nature or man-made to suit what they need. And so I'm trying to encourage you to think about when you've seen a bird in an area you're not thinking of, why? Why do you see them there? What can it replicate that you see them using that would normally have been in nature that they needed? And so trying to think about that. Here, moving in, kind of taking it a step further, talking about that urban birding habitat, more areas would include shorelines. So we're a perfect example. We have the Detroit River. This is a great picture I found online because it actually lists off those birds that you typically would see in those types of habitat. So whether it's a kestrel, a cowbird, a gull, a mallard, birds that you see spending a lot more time near water. Your inner city, so again, there's really not as much natural habitat, but that's not to say that those birds haven't adapted. Chimney swift's a perfect example. Your rock dove, crows, those common birds that typically are just used to being around humans are going to be in this area. So, but that's not to say that they are not less important than any other bird. They're just birds that we see more frequently because they've adapted to being around humans. They depend on bird feeders, nesting in man-made structures, things like that. And so thinking about what in those areas attract those birds. Moving over to the right, you have the buildings and shrubs. So kind of more of a middle ground of man-made, but also incorporating a lot of that natural habitat. You have a lot more trees and shrubs in those areas. So you'll start to break into a little bit more of those species that don't depend nearly as much on humans, but still slightly do. So your sparrows, your robins, chickadees, wrens, finches, cardinals, blue jays, all those types of things. They would be dependent on those types of areas as well. They would also have some bird feeders, houses, but also natural structures such as trees and shrubs. Moving over to the right to the last one, more mature residential areas. So your more suburb type areas. And that would be even a little bit more natural, not as many man-made structures, more natural features such as your trees, shrubs, water resources, flowers, things like that. So you'll continue to further see more of those species that still depend on humans, but again, a little less than the previous one. So I really love these two pictures because now we're kind of taking a step into the rural birding habitat. So I've been talking about the basics of what birds need, and diversity is always key. It's one of the most important things you can do, incorporating water, food, shelter, all of those things. Here, it really kind of goes to show if you have larger areas and more rural environments, keeping in mind it's not only about the diverse species, but it's also the sizes. So you have on the right, you have these wide range of heights. So you have certain trees that are a lot taller, a lot older. They have different canopy sizes. So you have your main canopy, subcanopy, understory, shrub layer, forest floor, and soil. So this is a really great example because it's not all about just one layer, one type of species. It's about the diversity of species, but also the diversity of canopy levels. So if you're looking at a forest, a healthy forest, as you're walking through, you wouldn't be able to see all the way through the forest. You would have higher, like really high trees, you'd have medium level trees, you'd have some healthy shrubbery, and on top of that, you'd have some small plants. So if you're in a forest, you would see your spring ephemerals, so your spring wildflowers or forest flowers, all of which are really equally important. And then which we'll show more pictures of later. The left picture I particularly love because it shows not only two dead tree stumps, but a dead tree that has fallen over. And so it really does a great job of showing the wide range of species that depend on these dead trees. So you have woodpeckers, rodents, chipmunks, squirrels, raccoons, you have salamanders, frogs, bats, all of which depend on dead trees. So if you're able to leave up dead tree stumps, it is just a crucial option. Even if you just pile up some thicker tree stumps in the back, it helps. And the more we can do that, the more healthy you have, the healthier ecosystem you have on your property and in your area. So this is another really good example of what I was talking about, is different canopy levels. So you want to have multi-stories, you want to have diversity, and not only is it something to think about in what you can plant, but it's also where you go. So when you go to a park, if you see a wide range of species, the bark looks different, but you can't tell what it is, but you know that they're different species. Or if you see shrubbery placed periodically, or if you see other ferns or other species growing, if you see water collecting, all of which indicates it's a healthier habitat. And it's something to think about when you're walking out and about, because I can tell you the hot spots, but maybe you have a small park near your house, or maybe you own a property that has all of these things in it and you weren't aware that it was great habitat. We will give you a list of hotspots here in a few minutes, but I want you to think about taking it further, thinking about in your own way, what's around you. And so this does a great job of it, does the layered vegetation with dense shrubs, rocks, logs, pond. They've even incorporated some man-made structures like a birdhouse. They have mulch leaf litter, so they've left it instead of raking it up. You have your bird nests, a couple of different ones, and it shows this really nice diverse habitat. And you don't need a big space to have diversity. So here's our hotspots that we were talking about. So this is just some of them. These are the common ones that we typically go to, or our partners go to a lot. That's not to say this is all of them. So there are plenty of others. Just looking at off the top of my head, there's a really nice park I think it's called Heritage Park in Farmington, is another wonderful hotspot. There's a park near where I live in Westland, and it's great because a small organization called SEMBA, Southeast Michigan Butterfly Association, restored a prairie there, took a basic park that people were using to go to and play at, and they restored some habitat. And that's something that's perfect to show, is you can use empty spaces. But these are various habitats. I do recommend Belle Isle. It's a great example. Point Moulet, if you are going to go there, I do want you to consider that it is I think 7 to 8 mile long walk, and it's rocky and uncomfortable. So if you are not wanting to walk a long distance, even though it's great birding, it can be a lot. And so kind of looking into the details of these hotspots, because some may be more comfortable to walk on than others, but that's not to discourage you to say that they aren't amazing birding hotspots. So reminder, just birds are everywhere. So one thing I do want to remind everyone here, whether you're a new birder, an experienced birder, intermediate, whatever it may be, always have patience. Birds aren't always where you expect them. They are everywhere, but they have wings, they fly. They may be in one area for a few minutes and then they may be gone the rest of the day. So you may go to a hotspot, but go for multiple reasons. Enjoy nature, enjoy wildlife, and just use it as a time to relax. And yeah, if you see birds, take wonderful pictures, send them to us. We love seeing them. But all in all, just remember birds are everywhere. Look up, listen, look around you. These two pictures are great examples because they're in areas that people may not necessarily expect to see them. So the peregrine falcon is on Wade State campus buildings all the time, as well as other buildings. They've adapted to nesting on man-made structures. Over to the left, you have a pheasant, a ring-necked pheasant, using an abandoned lot as nesting and habitat. I'm sure a lot of you, if you live in Detroit metro area, you might have seen pheasants fly over you on the highway or over roads because they're flying from one abandoned lot to another. So it's thinking about what's nearby you. It doesn't have to be a park. It could just be an abandoned lot that there's some natural species growing there. And you can go check it out. You might see a species you didn't expect. It doesn't always have to be nearby woods or refuges or preserves. Birds are everywhere. You just have to look for them. So, before I get into the bringing the birds to you, something I do want to mention from a previous slide I had was I mentioned the different diversity in canopy levels. Something to consider when you go to some natural parks, and if you ever have volunteer time, I recommend you look into. It's quite common if it looks like you can't see through a canopy, it doesn't always mean that it's good. In fact, more often than not, it's usually bad because most of the time those are invasive species taking over. And so I do recommend you reaching out if you see an area and you see a species that you don't recognize, or maybe you see there's too many of it. It could be an invasive, and that park may need help managing those invasives so they can be more effective at planting the natives to attract the birds and keep a better healthy habitat for our local species. So moving into the bringing birds to you. So I've kind of talked about this a little bit. I'll speed up a bit because I have been talking quite a lot. Native plants are one of the biggest things you can always do to help birds. So if you ever hear of a species that has Asian or something other than North America in the name, it's probably not native, and I highly encourage you to avoid planting it. Or if you haven't already, trying to replace it with something native because it does not have the same nutritional value that a native species does for our species here. So thinking about not only the flowers, but the early, mid, or late blooming flowers, because there are some that bloom earlier in the spring, which the pollinators need after it gets warm again. They don't have enough flowers or resources for food. So having a lot of early blooming flowers is really important that bloom somewhere between late March to early June. The mid ones are usually the most common species people plant. But also keeping in mind that late blooming flowers are also important because once it starts getting a little cold, those pollinators haven't quite gone down for the winter yet, and they need a food source. And so making sure you have the early and late blooming on top of your mid blooming flowers. Trees and shrubs, I cannot advertise it enough. It is super important that you have a wide range of trees and shrubs. And what I've been doing on my property is planting them on the edge of the property. So then I get to use the inside part and kind of have lower level to mid to higher as you go to the edge of my property. Feeders, bird baths, bird houses, all of those things are wonderful attributes you can have. And again, just keeping in mind the knowledge that you would need. So talk to local Wild Birds Unlimiteds about the feeders, bird baths, and bird houses, because keeping them clean to avoid diseases, cleaning them out to avoid predators, all of those things are really important when you're managing those areas. So taking it further, I mentioned earlier rain gardens. So planting native plants is important. You can plant natives in the rain gardens or other other gardens that you have on your property. Leaving dead wood, a lot of these things we've kind of just been talking about, but I'm reaffirming. I mentioned a space between the road and the sidewalks or your driveway. I have this little strip of about 2 feet between the edge of my property and my driveway. I planted tall grasses in between instead of leaving it barren. I filled it with something that I know will fill in and it's a great resource for other species. And so thinking about those unused spaces is one of the biggest things I can encourage you to do, because the 2 feet between my property line and my side or my driveway, I don't want to mow that. So I planted something that I can literally just leave alone and do nothing with. And it manages water retention, or it avoids any water retention. And so it's a great helpful resource. Creating the biodiversity, bird feeders, there's just a huge list of things that you can do to help birds. So one thing I kind of already, we already walked past it, but I'm sure a lot of you have corners of properties that is a really a big pain in the butt to mow. And instead of trying to mow those back corners of your property, do a little side corner, like cut out a triangle and plant, maybe it's shrubs, maybe it's flowers, maybe you plant a rain garden, or something related to a rain garden. Those I highly encourage, because it saves you time, it saves you gas. And then as they grow, you're actually increasing the number of plants you have for your nearby wildlife. From there, this is kind of just one of my last slides, but it's thinking about what you can do to help birds in your area. So if you have bird feeders, keeping them clean is one of the big things. Planting shrubs nearby, because that way if there is a predator such as a hawk or a cat, they have an area, the birds have an area to fly into for shelter. But besides, just if you happen to have cats that run loose, I do really highly recommend starting to put them on leashes. I have 2 cats, one of which I take on walks all the time outside, and he gets put on a leash frequently. It's the only way he's allowed outside. It does take time for them to get used to it, but once they do, they love the opportunity to get to go outside, and it's safer for the birds and other wildlife and safer for your cats, because then they don't have to worry about getting into danger, whether it's vehicles or poison or a predator getting a hold of them. It's all around safer for everything involved. From there, the 2 bottom pictures are 2 I really highly stress. Bird safe windows. If you're going to install bird safe window tape, make sure that the gaps between them are no bigger than 2 by 2 inches apart. And the reason why is because otherwise birds think they can fly through it. So if you put up 1 or 2 decals, they won't hit where the decals are, but they'll fly and hit it somewhere else. So I do recommend installing bird safe windows. Even if you don't think they're hitting the windows where your feeders are, they are. I can guarantee it. I do encourage you to install bird safe windows. From there, it's light pollution. So I'm sure a lot of you have lights on your garages, your houses, wherever it may be. This is a really great example of showing how you can keep those lights, but aiming the light downward. So most of the time it's that first image on the left where it says very bad. Once it has a top on it, does it reduce it? Yes, but it's still creating a lot of what we call light pollution. As it covers more of that light fixture, it does better. The best one is to the right, and it aims every single ounce of that light downward, which is a benefit to the birds. It reduces that overhead light. It increases the stars that you can see at night by reducing light pollution, which helps birds because they migrate in the fall and the spring, and light pollution does affect their migration. But it also helps you. It helps your house, reducing the electricity so you can use lower power light bulbs. And so it saves you on electricity, and it really directs all the light downward so you're able to see more effectively as you're walking around. So I do recommend doing these things, install them as you can, but those are my top safe birding tips for the birds. So here's just some recaps from the first 2. It's not even close to what we talked about, but just wanted to remind people that as you go out and about for birding, always dress for the weather in comfortable attire, but making sure that if the weather is bad or cold, making sure you are dressed appropriately for it. And if you watch those webinars, we will talk about some examples of what we recommend. So And then when out in nature, always remember to respect wildlife, respect others, pay attention to your surroundings, but above all else, enjoy yourself. We want you to have a wonderful time, enjoy it, and always want to be there to support nature as well as yourself. So we're working together as a whole for our community and for our birds. So. Thank you, everybody. Sorry it took a little longer than planned, but I'm going back through. Sorry some people had to leave. We will provide links here in a few seconds.
I did want to answer the question in the chat about what was a bird safe window. Because bird glass is pretty invisible to birds when they're flying. Bird safe window has designs on it. Sometimes that's visible to people, sometimes it's not, on it that birds can see, so that when they're flying, they don't run into the window. They can avoid it and go another direction.
Yes, thank you. Yep, so one
Yeah.
of the most common things you could install for bird safe windows is Kaleidoscape is the name brand. There are others. Kaleidoscape is one of the most recommended and most helpful when it comes to installing on your personal windows, but there are plenty of other options. You could buy tempera paint and paint little fun decals all over your own window instead of buying them. And it could be something fun you do with your families and friends. And yeah, just lots of things you can consider, but Kaleidoscape is probably one of the top ones I recommend. Any other questions?
I guess to answer the question, there was not a handout for this webinar, but it will be recorded. So you're free to go back and watch it. And then the other two recordings I placed in the chat, the link to that page is there as well. Thanks for coming out and learning with us today.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at any time. And we hope to see you at our next webinars. So, awesome. Thanks everybody.